Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is 7th in a group of 9, presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold, Scene 4. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, its massive journey aspires to examine in its entirety Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me, one I'm working tirelessly to complete. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off, the first stave of page 269 in Dover's full score, just following Erda's exit and Wotan's desperate attempt to stop her. A fermata caps the previous Erda iteration, a touch of suspense as Wotan's focus shifts from trying to stop her to mulling the Vala's prediction. His fellow immortals intuit their leader's change of mind, and Donner completely changes the mood by calling back the giants, his initial cry of "Hört!" separated by a dotted crotchet rest from his next phrase, a third above, which plunges an octave, the line as a whole sketching a high-ash interval. A pair of brash double impacts and horns to evoke the shock of their precursors, followed by big string quaver chords bracket this dire vocal interval. He continues in an outline of Erda's heroic notes by rising a fourth into a low-ash interval on a third, after which he falls a sixth, itself punctuated by 2 more stout quaver string chords. A violin-viola pulse of the treaty arpeggio decisively recalls that module only just hinted at through the ring fragment in Erda's last warning, its off-the-beat chord strikes energized with that double impact effect, thanks to low-string octavo quaver strokes on the beat. Their module is sustained by horns tracing an abandonment triad on minim chords, while Donner's voice rises a sixth, promising the Titans Das Gold, then describing melody notes to make an iteration co-opted from Alberich's Defiance. The Thunderer then leaps up a third into chord notes to inspire a thrilling ring-like expansion on semiquaver violins, sustained by a woodwind breve chord and punctuated at its lowest point with another horn double impact. Freya pathetically raises her hopes as the woodwind pedal sweetens, singing her one extended utterance in all the epic, a falling scale lightly tinged with resignation, punctuated after the English horn sinks on chord notes by a gentler double horn pulse. After a minim rest, she moves through a low-ash interval on a third to fall an aching sixth with the word Holda, one of her mythic names, as the woodwinds trace a ghost of Erda chords. Wondering if she's now deemed worth the ransom, Freya rises on reverse chord notes into a turn resembling something between Alberich's wooing and its giant version, ended by an embryonic fate pulse, an oral snapshot of her damaged self-worth. Honeyed in woodwind chording, a low string line rises on a curse-like reverse ring fragment, yet falls on reverse melody notes, renewed hope for Wotan's racial plans. Above it, violins slide down a kind of answering ring fragment crib, opposed by a rising viola arpeggio, itself similar to the reverse fragment module. This violin line anticipates similar but more urgent octavo violin passages, which in future typify the epic's anguish women, and this one telegraphs Freya's uncertainty of her fate versus that of the ring. The gods eye Wotan, still deep in thought, while a single iteration of Erda's morpheme ascends on murky low brass atop a timpani roll, erasing all doubt of his reverie's focus. Abruptly, trumpets in 3-part harmony leap decisively up that peremptory treaty crib, capped by the spear booming on trombones. Stage directions tell us the god fasst seinen Speer und schwenkt ihn. It's a syntactic combination similar to those heard twice before in Scene 2, as the god communicates with the giants, and while it could be argued this indicates the treaty he now means to keep, the context makes it plain this signifies not the pact itself, but the weapon's power to enforce it. Wotan calls Freya to him, crying a double impact to leap up an Erda fourth, the whole string choir in forceful support with a high whirl-dash interval on that same fourth, one of the few such intervals heard during Rheingold, its last two pulses echoing the god's double impact. More ominously, however, he completes the goddess's name to a plunging octave, both decisive and foreboding, then announces she's free to an a cappella reverse-dash interval on chord notes. After all, his decision is only partly magnanimous, undertaken as it is primarily for his own gain. Trombones answer him by twice punching semi-breve string chords off the beat, followed by double impacts on trombones, modules which bracket his melody note assertion that she's ransomed. He calls her back, holding his initial note for a semi-breve and crotchet, a vigorous semi-breve chord on strings punctuating him after a crotchet rest, voice and strings together suggesting another double impact. On the measure's last beat, horns repeat yet another double impact, harmonized at a third, from which they sync with the god's vocal in an unmistakable iteration of resignation, his words leaving no doubt of the real motive behind her rescue. Kehr uns die Jungen zurück. Wotan has no thought for Freya's power of love. He just doesn't want to die, and Erda's warning has set him thinking of little else. This also serves to add a potent element of resignation's ambivalent context. Meanwhile, a more leisurely string treaty strophe, supported with minim horn chording, broadens through a pair of measures, the first capped by a semi-quaver uprush on sextuplet low strings. This prefaces his verbal gift to the giant, rising a fourth into the next measure, the orchestra's syntax disappearing into a pair of quaver string chords on first and third beat, as he plunges a sixth to rise a third, this distortion of the curse injecting subtle irony. He moves from it on the words "Nehmt euren Ring" in two back-to-back chord notes, separated by a third descent as he throws the ring on the hoard. The following episode, without vocal, portrays the gods' joy as they reunite with the love goddess, its vaguely mawkish euphoria admirably disguising unexpected syntactic riches. Sustained by a hoard pedal, which is all but a breve, it begins in a series of 4 downward violin arpeggios which bear a suspicious resemblance to Alberich's protest at Wotan's theft, while oboes ascend in minims reminiscent of both the treaty and the god seen to aging. These hints grow stronger as the episode develops several more revealing elements in a remarkably dense bundle of syntactic wealth, which is also an object lesson in the Meister's technique for evolving his textures out of numerous modules without losing sight of any established associative meanings. Each of the initial 3 measures launch on horns and contrabasses with those double impacts, reflecting the giant's outrage, which have only just surrounded Donna calling them back, initiated Freya's hope of rescue, and peppered Wotan's decision in her favor. Oboes abandon their rising line for a pair of reverse Erda melody notes, intertwined with variants of the previous fragment-like violin arpeggios, similar to Alberich's wrangle with Wotan. Beneath their chord note tails, violas echo them with lines less like their counterparts. All of these vibrant string cells, however, are rooted in the oboe's reverse melody notes, violins sketching their extended versions, violas with pairs in their more wonted length, all to suggest the god's vigorous hope that his breeding scheme is now fully empowered to triumph over the dwarves. Violins, violas then unite in another treaty module, not dissimilar to the curse's reverse fragment, topped with a chromatically tinted scalar module hinting at Loge's influence, as octavo low strings hurry down in opposition to a spear-like scale with its own chromatic wrinkles. Atop the second of these 2 measures, woodwinds rise joyfully in chromatic extended melody notes, ending in a low whirl-dash interval on reverse chord notes, as clarinet's horns more forcefully intone the ash interval on a third, all of which includes yet another double impact to launch the brief episode's climactic measures. This consists of another echoing pair built on identical syntactic bundles. Its core is a descending figure on violins, violas at the lower octave, built from 2 chord notes separated by the descent of a third, a module which at first blush seems entirely non-syntactic and without precedent in the work. Yet we've just heard it in Wotan's voice as he bids the giants, "Nimmt eurem Ring." But this cell's genesis reaches still further back, explaining its presence here while clarifying its significance at this juncture. In Scene 2, when the gods age, Freya's second half wilts, denatured into the same sinking pair of Erda chord notes, albeit there separated by 6th descents. Its quasi-rehabilitated presence in this moment serves to emphasize Wotan and his fellow gods value Freya not for her quality of love, but for the eternal youth she brings them. Horns emphasize the first of its chord notes, then, with each of the following measures, massed woodwinds intone the Welterbe triad, rapidly acquiring a sense of the Father God's vision for a racial solution to his ring problems, a tie-in with the reverse Erda melody notes, which launch the passage. In performance, the strings iterations on violins, doubled octavo by violas, cellos, of Freya's arpeggio often obscure this detail, but Seattle's recent Frisch recording, Eno's Goodall, and the redoubtable Knappersbusch render clearly audible its Welterbe strophes as they're sounded across the full high woodwind choir, oboes, clarinets, octavo. What strikes one as odd is how little this passage relies on the love goddess's module most redolent of empathetic love, but its denatured echo made this episode's core explains that. At the passage's highest emotional pitch, strings woodwinds do briefly return to Freya Part 2, albeit in yet another distorted form. Violins, violas, and, for one measure, flutes wipe it away by cascading down a spear-like scale. Its woodwind, horn, low-string pedal progressively dissolves into one on strings alone as first violins intone a gentle duo cribbing on the chord note cell without its drop of a third, making it 2 reverse melody note pulses. That module born of Alberich's frustrated wooing and the god's own breeding prerogative, one that haunts the dwarves of Nibelung, never mind the curse itself. Wotan's joy at Freya's return is naturally clouded by his pain of losing the ring, but also his fear of what may become of Alberich and his dwarves, never mind his still unformed plans for regaining the ring through a similar breeding scheme. The sequence ends with one of its most sophisticated evolutions as the first violin line alters its reverse melody note strophes by falling a third between their initial notes, making them a reminder of Fafner's Scene 2 gloat as he contemplates the gods withering away. For each of these pulses, their concluding chord notes grow even stronger. A striking aspect of this passage is its syntactic portrait, less of the other immortal's joy than of Wotan's mixed reaction to Freya's rescue, making this triumph an outward excess of jubilation with deep interior ambivalence. Its central morpheme has far more to do with the ring going to the giants than it does with the boon of Freya's return. What's more, it's prefaced by syntax obsessed with Alberich's nascent racial solution to his loss of the ring, the giant's outrage, along with the god's potential answer to those threats, while fraught with loge chromatics. Perhaps more telling than anything, the Erda chord notes are the episode's most prevalent syntactic element, 9 iterations in as many measures, and sole building block of the passage's central melody. The chord note morpheme is one whose import is generally agreed to be that of sorrow, loss, even slavery, and its first 2 pulses, punching, then dominating the celebration, give it the subtlest of bittersweet tones. Lastly, as in all its appearances throughout the ring, it casts Erda's all-dreaming shadow. Loge, it should be noted, hasn't uttered a word since his last plea for the Rhine maidens, making Erda the one character in Rheingold to whom the fire god never speaks. But in terms of this analysis, he doesn't need to, being in communication with her at all times, through mysterious channels never divulged, yet implicit in their close natural relationship, the powers of fire, inspiration, cunning, and libido linked in nature's all-encompassing, ceaseless change. Indeed, the fire god may also be struck dumb by the Vala's advice, lacking as it does any mention of the Rhine maidens. Having heard her, Loge realizes how, if not precisely why, she has played him the way she's done, and it inspires some unexpected behavior once Fasolt and his brother fall to bickering over division of the gold. Syntactically, that wrangle also expands upon the innate change being wrought in the giants by the ring, just as it has affected gods and Nibelungs. One practical stage reality of this sequence is that it distracts the immortal clan from the giants, who must be gathering up the horde while their betters jubilate. Bassoon's timpani dispel the gentler mood, dragging attention back to the Titans by announcing regular giant thumps. Their swift graces now an eerie reminder of Alberich's resentment, each thump followed with Nibelung tattoo strophes on 3 horns, while, augmented by 4th horn, the string pedal shifts to bitter diminished minor. After 1 measure of thump tattoo bundles without vocal, atop 5 more of them, Fasolt scolds his brother for his unfair distribution of the horde, his vocal static notes moving into a triplet, an angry inverted Aschenniveau on a 3rd, and, after a crotchet rest, resuming on that 3rd above to plunge a 5th on a triplet, then up another 5th into chord notes. His 2 phrases roughly echo one another, the first running through triplet melody notes to fall on chord notes, then plunge another accusative 5th. The second, begun on the 4th above, rises a 3rd into more chord notes and a last plunging 5th. During his complaint's last 3 measures, violins harmonized and 3rds sink on extended reverse melody notes, a bit like Resignation, and with its final measure, viola's contrabasses echo the bassoon's giant thump. Fafner's response nails what's at work here. The usual scales here on cellos launch 3rd horn's giant thumps, now denuded of timpani. So soon after Alberich's curse, however, it's impossible not to hear them as a reflection of resentment. These have increased the heat with 2 per measures, while clarinets add the Erda chords in their most baleful minor mode incarnation, suggesting the ring's power, and not the Rhine maiden's joy, chords violas cap with Nibelung tattoo pulses. While not entirely quirky, this syntax appears outwardly superficial, given the tattoo is specific to the dwarves, not their treasure. The horde, root of the siblings' quarrel, would seem more apt, and, while it does play a role in the earlier piling episode, makes no appearance here. Yet there's a strong underlying reason for the tattoo, which Fafner's vocal reveals. It turns on a pair of echoing yet syntactically varied phrases, both launched by Erda melody notes, the first ending in a sneering crib of Freya's pivotal morpheme for empathetic love, which Fafner breaks into a chord note opposition, separated by a descending 3rd, a twisting of the god's jubilation over Freya. His second phrase answers the first's melody notes, separated by the upward leap of a 4th from their reversal, with its growing sense of the god's plans for countering loss of the ring, one that implies the giants as well. This also amounts to shattering at its backbone Wotan's giant opposing turn. Fafner's contemptuous jab at his brother also contains a specific epithet omitted in Porter's translation, verliebten Geck. Fasolt's highest virtue, now tarnished by his greatest vice, conjures the Meister's view of this lovesick giant as the tragic hero of Rheingold, whose mixture of contempt, greed, and frustrated affection here looks forward to the pole upon which so much of Götterdämmerung turns. But it must first pass through the events of Valkyr and Siegfried, where this opposition of melody notes takes unexpected flower. Meanwhile, the Erda chords hint the Vala's dreams conjure this event to prepare that unknown territory, given the morpheme's prominence in her warning to the gods, whose immediate fruit is this fatal wrangle. This mix of resentment the giant thumps and the tattoo with the giant's behavior makes them both seem more like Albrecht and Mina than they do themselves, recalling when the tattoo first appears in embryonic form with the cords, to suggest similar changes already at work in the Nibelung race thanks to the ring. Sabor's comment about the piling of the gold seems even more apt here. Fafner continues his self-justifications as cords, tattoo, and giant thumps disappear, the cello resentment scales quickening their pace to 4 per measure, while reversing their upward scales into swift backward grace turns, vaguely reminiscent of Albrecht's personal syntax, the giant turn and the dwarf's release after losing the ring. During this, over a semi-breve bassoon pedal, clarinets lift their crotchet chording into a single truncation of the cello turns, and Fafner leaps down a third then up a sixth, another warped cursed lust pulse, to double the clarinet's reversed melody notes, which he caps in a falling tritone, that interval destined to become his signature. With the next measure, bassoons forsake their pedal to follow clarinets in thirds, a pair of cells, the first rising on heroic Erda melody notes, the second the abandonment triad, both finished on reverse melody notes, making them backward echoing ring strophes. Fafner doubles these vocally as he states, no doubt in truth, that had they kept Freya, Fasolt wouldn't have shared her, pursuing his defense on a pair of chord notes supported by violas, cellos, and the chords themselves, the Earth Mother ratcheting up this quarrel. He concludes with a tattoo pulse, to finish after static notes on a plunging fifth, saying, because of his brother's stinginess with the goddess, Fafner deserves the lion's share of gold. Second violin's violas rush up a demi-semiquaver scale, Fasolt's rage as he cries his bitter indignation with an inverted ash interval on a dire falling octave, followed by a rising one to conclude a pulse of the Rhine Maiden's joyful bounce, an odd touch soon explained by his next vocals. Apart from downward-rushing violin-viola scales and low-string tremolos, disjoined into that distinctive pulse from Wotan's presentation of the gold, Fasolt's voice dominates, an indication his words are especially meant to be heard. Prefaced by another plunging string scale, he calls on the gods to mediate, his voice bouncing up a third into Flosshilda's heroics, its sense of resistance concluded on a downward seventh charged with Erda's inspiration. After a crotchet rest, fifths both plunging and rising separate his extraordinary vocal combination of the nymph's bounce with its retrograde, sevenths being the leaping intervals of both morphemes, which also juxtapose the Welterb triad with its inversion, abandonment. A representative of nature, like the Rhine Maidens, Fasolt's plea both mirrors and distorts their joy, in which Wotan recognizes only his own selfish plans, while rejecting any consideration for the giants, the stage directions instructing him to wendet sich verächtlich ab, from the Titan's appeal for justice. This gross dereliction of the god's duty as lawgiver provides Loge, Erda's functionary, his needed opening, who hops in after his long silence to advise Fasolt the hoard is nothing beside the far more valuable ring. Sung atop 4 identical resentment truncations on cellos, violas, and strident muted horn, his vocal is still more enlightening. After a static ash interval, he rises then falls on Erda fourths, followed by a remarkable evocation of the Rhine Maiden's taunts for Albrecht in Scene 1, itself prefaced with a quicker static ash interval to be shaped by the heroic Erda melody notes. The fire god can't help but know this amounts to Fasolt's death sentence, and it seems like pure spite. Given how Loge must feel about Erda at this moment, perhaps it is. Yet it might also be considered a mercy-killing. Though Fasolt dies, he's spared the ghastlier doom of slavery to the ring, which, as the drama shows, makes the rest of Fafner's life a misery worse even than death. Whatever the case, Fasolt grabs for the ring and the altercation becomes physical, underscored by sextuplet viola tremolos supporting two woodwind developments of the ring, all but identical to that portraying Mima's vain hopes of vanquishing his own brother in Scene 2, which parallel the syntax acknowledges. Complete with rising scale coda built from a pair of Erda melody notes, this variant draws a subtle parallel between the sibling rivalry of both races, pointing ahead to where each eventually leads, the second of which Fasolt's voice roughly doubles, after leaping up a fifth with a Welterb triad and the nymph's taunt, a cursed lust echo, and on the words, "Mine is der Ring." The scuffle escalates over the second ring pulse's rising scale, as Fasolt's vocal bounces down a third to rise on an abandonment triad into another falling third and rising fifth, a second exact duplicate of Cursed Lust. During this, his second phrase, the strengthened woodwind choir launches a solitary ring fragment Welterb to rise again, not with melody notes but a double crib of the Rhine Maiden's taunts, further identifying Alberic's frustrations with those of the giants, one which Fasolt's protesting vocal freely ghosts. Not coincidentally, this module also crests at its top with an abandonment triad. His doubling taunt repetition centers on leaping thirds, and, concluded by a rising fifth, again reiterates Cursed Lust. That module has played a subtle but continuing role in the work's syntax, and soon contributes to the god's plans for Valkyrie. Reinforced woodwinds lift in a syncopated extension of the treaty over a sustained timpani roll as Fafner claims the ring for himself, his static notes separated by a quaver pause and capped in a low ash interval on a third. Horns, bassoons, and semiquaver strings resume the ring in its Mima guise, launched by a cymbal Valhalla ash interval strophe followed by another in trombones on the upbeat, launching a second ring iteration over which Fasolt seizes the bauble, voice bouncing down a third on a reverse ash interval, only to rise after a quaver rest on that same interval into a static interval, capped by chord notes. As urged by Loge, this foolhardy deed triggers the catastrophe as prefaced by familiar yet unexpected syntax. It launches on horns bassoons by syncing naturally enough on the ring fragment, recalling how it began Scene 3, as well as Mima's description of Nibelungs under Alberic's thumb, here doubled in violin viola tremolo semiquavers to ratchet up the tension. Both giants are now in its thrall, and on the brink of radically altering their species. The passage then rises to climax as reinforced by woodwind's horns, trombones doubling the speed of their Valhalla ash interval pulses, a swelling cymbal roll on the second measure, on 6 variants of the Welterb triad, also doubled in violins violas. That module, sensed first in the Rhine Maiden lullaby, has passed through Alberic's frustrated wooing to the ring itself, then Wotan's admiration for his fortress. From there, it informs the dwarf's magic in forging the ring, where it particularly resembles its current repetitions. Its prior evolutions continue through the dwarf's tyranny over his Nibelung slaves, a power Wotan observes and assimilates, until, in Scene 4, he feels comfortable enough with it to abuse both the fallen dwarfs and the giants, which takes an ironic turn in the form of Fasolt's nobility in returning Freya untouched. Writing this climax, Fafner's vocal bounces down a reverse ash interval on a third, then after a quaver rest in static notes, up the same third, to preface the mortal blow he delivers to his brother. A full orchestral semi-breve chord launches the deed itself, punctuated by the full string choir after a wide chord on the downbeat and minim rest, with an uprushing demi-semiquaver scale which then plunges through a pair of Welterb triads. The woodwind brass pedal disappears, leaving 7 thunderous static quaver pulses on timpani, violas, and low strings as, moving through a pair of vertiginous time sign shifts, they slow into 2 penultimate strokes on timpani and low strings, alone, finished with a last brutal Valhalla Ashenivil timpani pulse over a ghastly octavo tremolo on low strings. This murder, the first on-stage killing in the ring, never mind in its world's history so far as it's shown in the ring, should come as a massive shock to audiences. It takes place, or should, bloodily and viciously before an audience's eyes, as if virtually out of nowhere. While the brothers' quarrel is expected, Fafner strikes without warning and with what, for Wagner, is lightning speed. Though an audience doesn't yet know it, Fasolt's murder sets the tone for all crucial on-stage deaths to follow, every one of them familial. In Valkyr, Wotan effectively kills both Siegmunda and Sieglinde, his own children, while in Siegfried, the named hero slaughters Fafner, who is likely his distant blood relation, and Mima, who is his de facto father. After which, in Götterdämmerung, Gunther compasses the murder of his blood brother Siegfried. Hagen strikes down his half-brother Gunther, is himself drowned as a result, and the Volsung's consort Brunhilde, the hero's aunt, destroys herself on his behalf. All 8 deaths in one way or another motivated by the ring. Meanwhile, the gods are themselves relatives with Wotan, Brunhilde's father, and pass away, cataclysm triggered by the Valkyrie. There is possibly another overlooked blood relation involved in this stunning mayhem, but that's another point to await its own time. This strange, distant, but obvious doubling is no coincidence. If separated by great stretches of the epic, the Meister intended these deeds to reverberate in tandem, linking together the narrative from beginning to end. Fasolt's Rheingold murder is resolved only in the drama's last chapter, that episode's final death bringing together a host of issues surrounding this first slaughter, its notions of racial dominance having percolated through the intervening action. It's no accident the ring fragment, with its connotations of racial change, prepares and follows Fafner's mortal blow, an act which triggers a pivotal rift in the giant race, while the reverse melody notes of the curse's coda invoke the work's other crucial morpheme denoting race. Wagner's prose draft of 1848 and 1851 show this idea gripped him from the beginning. It is still the giants en masse who had coveted and obtained the ring, Fafner being the last survivor of the strife that had broken out among them afterwards for the possession of it. In refining and condensing his original vast scheme, Wagner reduced the onstage giants to a pair of brothers, embedding the broader ramifications of this racial conflict in his music. Sadly, the allegorical school wreaks havoc on this important but neglected backstory, since 2 giants are more than sufficient for that transition's symbolic purposes, and all their considerations stop there. But a credibly realistic look at the tale should keep in mind, as the Meister did, not just 2 representative giants, but their entire tribe. This is as true for the Nibelungs, though analysts of the highest order feel bound to discourage such questions. Wagner, however, didn't think the question unanswerable which Cook poses, as shown in his prose drafts for Siegfried. The draft for Act 2 had originally run thus. Nidwald, Albrecht comes up out of the earth with Nibelungs. They have to follow him. It was Wagner's intention then, in the early days of May 1851, to introduce the Nibelungs, still subject to Albrecht, in this scene. In order to fully glean how the Meister perfects and subsumes this idea into his finished work, an eye should be kept on the subsequent drama for its emerging syntactic threads. Despite such a mountain of evidence for its importance, most productions tend to handle this first of all murders primly and without any real shock. Possibly inspired by Schroe in 1976, Lisieu's Kupfer in 2005 opts to have Fafner slap Fasolt's back with a hand, an obvious prosthetic whose flimsiness makes the death hard to credit, never mind vaguely amusing. A failing Vienna exacerbates in 2016, whose Fafner uses his staff, which simply bounces off Fasolt's padded costume. 1989's Munich version by Leinhoff gives Fafner a dagger, a more promising notion, but the blow is hidden from view by Fasolt's body, while Mariinsky's Fafner in 2008 simply bumps Fasolt's massive rock costume, who slips from it quite delicately to the floor. Still more demure, China in 2016 has Fasolt in the wings, at whom Fafner makes a few thrusts with his staff, while Bayreuth's 1992 version places both giants out of view behind a set element from which a Fasolt double falls with a dusty clink of plastic. With all its technological verve, in 2007, Valencia's mechanized Fafner merely touches his brother's machine with the prosthetic hand, and Fasolt slumps dead. While, despite Albrecht's grisly dismemberment when Wotan seizes the ring, Copenhagen's 2006 Fafner does no more than aim a few gentle blows at Fasolt's back with a plastic pipe. The most glaring error in all these versions is they make it impossible to believe such light abuse causes a giant to expire. In 2012, Teatro Argentino takes the most successful approach. It's Fafner shooting Fasolt with a pistol, even delivering a second coup de grace to his head, with the added touch that their Loge hands the giant his weapon, then takes it back from him to hide the evidence. Unfortunately, as with Copenhagen, both of them modern dress productions, this raises another believability issue whose Wotans would and should by rights use this as an excuse to convict Fafner and take back Ring and Gold. But this flaw is inherent in Wagner's own libretto, one exacerbated by all available productions, their gods standing about looking helpless as Fafner departs the scene accompanied by not one but two booming iterations of the curse. As guardian of law, surely Wotan can take the murder as invalidating his contract with the giants, curse or no curse. The slaughter and its following curse iterations must leave a sonic visual impression of the deed's horror so indelible in an audience's mind it not only defeats this objection, but sets the stage for the all-important Valkyrie Act 2 monologue. Paraphrasing Fafner himself, one feels bound to urge future directors, "Verstatt uns die Ritze." In all events, Fafner seizes back the ring, while atop sustained low-string tremolos he gloats over the dying Fasolt with two rhythmically disjointed vocal lines. The first moves through static notes to rise a third, fall a tragic sixth, then lift another third, yet another unique retrograde distortion of curse lust. This triggers an ominous, slow ring fragment on horns bassoons, for, as the syntax leading up to it underlines, his brother's death certainly alters the giant's racial course. Over the fragment's last notes, Fafner declaims his final line until Siegfried, leaping back up almost painfully on a sixth to fall a third, then intone three static notes and end with a reverse ash interval on chord notes. With Fafner's last pitch, a soft timpani roll takes over for the low-string tremolo, and as it crescendos, staccato violins twice intone Valhalla ash intervals, like shivers of horror, ended on one strong offbeat quaver to announce the curse, its melody on three strident trombones, its coda voiced by the tuba choir. As the coda's last note fades, Wotan acknowledges its power by singing a protracted ring fragment, capped in a reverse ash interval on the words Fluches Kraft. The timpani swell again, and mass trombones intone a second curse iteration, this one lowered a whole step and more shattering than the first. Most striking, perhaps, is this second pulse's total lack of the morpheme's coda, which, given Fasolt is dead, suggests this second pulse indicts not him, but Wotan himself. The Immortals' nascent racial plans are yet to be attacked, after all, as suggested by the coda's missing reverse melody notes. As the god observes in Valkyr, Der Fluch, den ich floh, nicht flieht nun mich. As the curse's last note fades, cellos terminate the long timpani roll by slithering up the initial scale of resentment to launch 12 consecutive iterations of that morpheme, its syncopated pulses on viola's bassoons, as Loge jumps in with a double-edged irony. Launching his mini-arietta, the first two measures of resentment sound in its ring-derived minor seventh harmonies, then shift into brighter territory, the third resentment strophe changing to major mode, as the fire god's gentle mockery unfolds. Wotan is lucky, Loge notes, to have seized the ring, but luckier still to give it away, since over it his enemies now slaughter one another. The fire sprite's first vocal rises on reverse chord notes to lift a sixth into static notes, then fall in Erda fourth and rise a third, another curse-lust distortion, here capped with chord notes. As when the fire sprite urges Fasolt to seize the ring, the resentment pulses double in number, 2 per measure, Loge moving to Wotan's theft of the ring after a minim rest, his vocals sketching a reverse ash interval trailed by reverse melody notes from which he rises on a fourth into more reverse notes, subtly mocking the god's racial aspirations. After a quaver rest moving through the heroic melody notes, a low ash interval in their top pitches, he falls a prescient seventh. After another quaver rest, he caps the phrase with a chord note opposition, meaning a sunny version of the dragon, and a merry rising sixth. As for losing the ring to the giants, violins double the cello's resentment scales, with 4 boisterous iterations of the giant thump on massed horns, while viola chords replace resentment's pulses with that unique rhythm from Wotan's horde presentation. Resting atop this syntactic bundle for a dotted minim, the fire god resumes on the upbeat by describing Wotan's Feinde with a static ash interval capped in an accusative falling octave, the word ze, lifted a fifth and isolated between 2 quaver rests, yet another more extreme distortion of the curse-lust cell. 2 horns delivers the last giant thump over fading tremolo violas, which conclude on a last pulse, recalling the god's delivery of the gold, as the fire sprite finishes his thought with Flosshilda's heroics, itself built